Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. It's Thursday late afternoon, so just wanted to give anybody a heads up that maybe put their question in after this period of time. If I missed it, please just ask again in next week's Q&As. I never like to miss them, but it happens sometimes. Sometimes they come in after the wire, or sometimes I just mess up and delete a file in post or anything like that. So anyway, let's jump in and see what we got. First up, there's a couple of questions over on the YouTube support page, so I'm just going to start there. Retron said, is it as impossible as some people say to get a digital mod for the Saturn like we've been getting for other platforms? So it's not that it's impossible, it's that no one's ever reverse engineered the two video chips. And so you would have to do that, and then you would have to find a way to combine those signals. Once again, I'm very much oversimplifying this. However, there are talks of a Mr. core for the Saturn, but I guess more specifically, there's talks of an FPGA core. No one's, I think, sure if it would even run on the Mr., if it would take a faster one, etc. But I think when that happens, if it's reverse engineered enough for a working or even semi-working FPGA core, there's a possibility that you would be able to get a digital output for it. But you know, in all honesty, the Saturn looks really great with some of the scalers that we have out there now. I think the RetroTink products and the smoothing filter do a really, really good job for the 3D graphics on the Saturn. And I think for any of the 2D games, something like an open source scan converter, or I guess the RetroTinks as well, but you know, if you want super sharp, you could go with that. And those are great solutions. So it's, you know, while I do hope that there's digital solutions for everything, it's not as big a deal with consoles that natively output RGB and could have plug and play really good quality solutions. At least those are just my opinions. But to answer your question directly, it's not going to be as impossible if somebody could correctly reverse engineer the chips. Until then, yes, impossible. Brian Wims said they have some RF-only consoles that use RCA connectors. They were considering converting those to BNC and connecting them to an Extron crosspoint that would output to a VCR. RF isn't actually supported, but is there any problem with using it like that? If you put it through the composite video line and you don't get any video or audio interference, it probably is fine, but I've never tested that before. You might be better off getting an RF switch, an RF combiner, using a different kind of just manual push button switch to run all the RF through it, and then that into a VCR or something. But it's worth experimenting with. The Extron devices are pretty robust, so you know, if you try it out just for a test, it's not going to hurt anything. You'll probably just hear or see some distortion. I just wouldn't really count on it. And you said, also, do you have any recommendations for RGB HV BNC cables? I wanted to connect two cross points together, and the cables I've seen are much longer than I need. I would check Monoprice. A lot of the stuff that's on Amazon is also on Monoprice, so that's probably a good place for those. There's also MarkerTech or MakerTech or something, but they're pretty expensive. If you go to RetroRGB.com/oscilloscopes, there are links to where I have all of the best quality BNC stuff, which is really expensive. You definitely don't need those for your average gaming. Even like a super fancy RGB to 4K setup, like these are the difference with a lot of the BNC cables for those purposes are measurements on an oscilloscope. That's why they're on the page. But if you punch through those links, you might actually be able to find one that has a cheaper brand and all different sizes. So I know I bought a couple of 1 foot BNC cables, but they only had the expensive ones, so they were like $8 each or something like that. But for the exact setup I need them for, they were perfect and worth the money. Next up, Scotter140 said they're following up on the question from the previous week about the picture cutting out when they use the Super Nintendo with their OSSC. They've tried it in all modes and have the same issue, and they've also been playing a lot of Sega Genesis and have no issues at all, besides jail bars that are already in the Genesis. It's been suggested that I install a DJitter mod, but I'm not convinced. Curious what your thoughts are. All right, so this is, now it's 99% that that's what it is. It's the signal that the SNES and NES output, which would cause issues with many modern displays or capture cards. Now, whether you want to install a DJitter in your console or not depends on one thing. Do you want to mod your consoles for use with the OSSC, or do you want to try to change your setup to work with your consoles? I know it's like a chicken and the egg type of thing. I'm not trying to get metaphorical on you or anything, but basically the problem, quote unquote problem, with the OSSE is that it's just a line doubler, line tripler, line quadrupler, and all of that, and it doesn't really cut out or change the rest of the signal. So the OSSE Pro, there's a good chance that that might be able to buffer just a few lines, not frames, but lines. So we're talking a couple of milliseconds of lag, if that, and have absolutely no need for DJitter mods. And there's other scalers out that coming out in the next year or two that may or may not fix that. And it's one of these things where it's like, if you have a working setup and you don't plan on upgrading, sure, if it's just the Super Nintendo, maybe do the DJitter and be done with it. But if you're constantly evolving your setup, or if you had plans on changing it, that's something that that's probably just something to think about and really consider overall. I am really curious why it's cutting out in all modes, though, because in all of the displays I've tested, if it worked at all, it would definitely work in 480p with no problems and no cutouts. I've seen a few just not work at all. Those were mostly cheap computer monitors, though, strangely enough. In 5X, it's very common that it doesn't work at all. So kind of strange that it doesn't work in any mode, so maybe that's enough for you to do the DJitter mod to it. But I have no problem with any of this stuff. I just like to try to put it into perspective because I don't want people to spend money on something that they don't need. Also, you posted an easy tip. The LG OLED's naming convention are based on year, apparently. So C6 is 2016, C9 is 2019, CX is 2020. This year's will be the C1. So I'm not sure what they're going to do, 5 years from now, but that's a handy trick. Thank you very much. Also, Scotter140 made a little joke about interviewing Bob Lazar based off a comment I made on a recent live stream. It's funny, all kidding aside, I would love to do fun and weird and different interviews, but I don't think RetroRGB is the place for that. I've really toyed with having my own personal channel that, respectfully, I don't care if anybody watches. No offense. There's some fun things that I want to do for me. And if other people enjoy it, awesome. And if they don't, that's cool too. But I just don't think that RetroRGB is the right place to post all that. And I don't have enough time to do two things at the moment. I would love to be able to. That's just not where it's at the moment. So hopefully I will have another channel, and who knows, maybe someday I might actually be able to do a crazy and fun interview like that. But anyway, glad you enjoyed the live stream at least. Now, over on Patreon, Goodknight says, what would you recommend for component switches? I've got a Wii and a Genesis with HD Retrovision cables, and I'm planning on getting a Saturn, Dreamcast, and an SNES in the next few years, with hopes of using the HDRs for as many consoles as I reasonably can. I was looking at the G-Comp switch, but it's out of my price range at the moment. However, because I run everything through my OSSC anyways, I was wondering if there was anything cheaper with enough inputs, or something else like the G-Comp 4 input, or anything like that. And is there any tips to with using switches to keep the video quality crystal clear, other than making sure only one console is on at a time? All excellent questions. So let me run you through all of these things. First, any basic push-button mechanical switch would be a good place to start. I'm a fan of the Otaku Store switches. I didn't see any signal degradation at all when I tested them. I didn't spend, I didn't do like an ultra crazy deep dive, but I certainly did enough testing and put stuff on a scope just to make sure that there wasn't, something giantly crazy going on. And that's 6 inputs, 1 output. Just remember, it's not dual output. And if you get the RCA versions, each input could either be RCA or SCART, but you can't use both at the same time. You can't even if the consoles are off, you can't have both plugged into at the same time. 6 inputs total, 1 output total, only those plugged in at once. I just want to make sure I'm clear because I don't want anybody harming their consoles like that by accident. But those are great, and you get to support people in the retro gaming community, so that's always a plus. Check the price range and see if that's something you'd be into. If not, you could look for any kind of older equipment on eBay that used to be really expensive. So like an 8-port Extron crosspoint and a big bag of BNC to RCA connectors. I guess technically it would be RCA to BNC. And with the cheap connectors, buy the cheapest ones you could find and buy twice as many as you need. So, you know, if they come in 10, 20, or 50 and you think you might need 25, buy the 50 because you'll probably throw a couple out. You'll probably plug in, like, out of every 10, you might find one that when you plug it in, if you wiggle it, you drop signal. Just toss it in the garbage. It's much cheaper to do it that way than to buy the expensive ones. And unless you're running through a scope for testing, there's no need. As long as it doesn't drop signal when you wiggle it, it's fine. And you could pick, you know, with the adapters and the crosspoint, you could probably pick that up, depending where you're located, for about the same price as the Otaku Switch. You know, of course, though, you could also find used G-Coms. You could also try to find anything else out there that's a manual push-button switch for super cheap and hope it's not, you know, hope it's not too bad. But overall, you know, you get what you pay for. So an old piece of equipment that's still in good condition, that's going to be a great choice, but it is a used piece of equipment, so it could last 100 years or it could last 100 days, who knows. The G-Comps are designed by and for retro gamers, so they're very expensive, but you know, if you need dual simultaneous output and auto switching, that's the only place to really get that brand new for, when you put it into perspective, a reasonable price. And the only other thing is always use good cables every step of the way. The moment you put a bad cable in there, it could throw something off. So you're using HD Retrovisions in, great. Jump on Amazon or go to Castlemania and get their plug-to-plug basic cables, so they're just RCA on both ends, and use those to connect that to your display or that to your OSSC in your case. And same thing with, you know, if you need to connect two switches, you know, go HD Retrovision all around, and their basic RCA ones are reasonably priced as well. Once again, they're not cheap, but you get what you pay for. And I've seen a lot of stuff on Amazon that looks shielded and thick, but it's just an unshielded, very thin conductor with a bunch of foam around it. So it looks and feels like a shielded cable, but you open it up and you realize it's going to get you just as much interference as the super thin one. So all good questions, but hopefully I was able to point you in the right direction. Blue Rigel 81 said they have a Model 2 Sega CD that has some issues powering on. They've had it for several years, and the issue appeared within the last year or two. They've used the Sega CD with a Model 1 Genesis, and sometimes when they turn on the power switch, the Genesis turns on, but not the Sega CD. If they toggle the power switch a time or two, the Sega CD eventually turns on and stays on, and after that it powers up consistently if they toggle the power again. Games are still playable, and I have a Mega SD card now anyway, but I'm curious what could be causing the issue. As far as I know, the capacitors have never been replaced, so my guess is it's related to that. What are your thoughts? That's kind of what my gut's telling me. I would try for cheap and easy fixes first that you could also use elsewhere, like try replacing the power supplies, the external power supplies, with the new triads that Castlemania sells. If that's not the fix, now you have brand new triads that you could use, you know, in the future on multiple different consoles. So while it is some money to be spent, it's a safe purchase because now you have another tool in the toolbox, or maybe it solves your issue. But I think it's just realistic to expect that any old electronics like these are going to eventually need the capacitors replaced. And stuff like this does kind of sort of sound like it could be the caps not charging up right away. So I would look into that. The only thing I learned the hard way on a Model 2 Sega CD is the coating on the bottom is ultra thin. And I recapped my own, and I was so proud of myself. I did such a good job. But once or twice I would use the desoldering gun to also pull up the pins of the capacitors and then desolder it. Maybe once or twice as I was pulling it up, I slipped and the gun skipped across the bottom of the motherboard, but lightly. I wasn't like putting pressure and like trying to, you know, bend these things up. I mean, when you put a hot iron on it, they bend really easily. And just that light skipping across the motherboard, it happened twice. And when I gave it to Jose to work on, because unfortunately he gets all my fails, he found a cut trace and I think a component that got bumped a little bit, probably through both of those. So if you're not really comfortable doing a cap replacement, or if you just don't have as much patience as you should, apparently I don't have enough, then I would try to find a reputable modder to do it. There's a ton of caps caps in it, so it's not going to be cheap. But this is a piece of hardware that you want to have and collect. And even though you use the Mega SD, it's important to you like it is many of us, I would consider doing that because you'll probably never need to do it again throughout your lifetime at this point, especially because the caps that we generally use in retro gaming now to do restorations are expensive, high quality ones. And I always try to make the point that it would have been very stupid for game console manufacturers of the day to use expensive capacitors because for most people, they would not have wanted to spend a lot of extra money per console. I mean, if you think about it, right, if they spent $3 more per console just to upgrade capacitor or resistor quality, and they sold 20 million consoles, that's a lot of money lost. So I don't blame them for using, in most cases, just decent ones. Sometimes in the case of like the Game Gear and the Duo consoles, terrible caps, but I don't blame them so much. I just, I did want to make the point because even though the console's 30-ish years old, these new caps might last longer than that because they're better quality. So you get, it's always just one of those things of how much money you want to sink into it. But if you love your Sega CD, consider it. Kieran O'Donnell said they have a Pro CRT with both inputs and outputs, like standard PVM style monitors do, and it's only 15 kilohertz. They also have a Wii, and they're wondering if they hook up the Wii using component cables to the inputs of the CRT, then run from the outputs into a flat panel. Could they have the Wii set on 480i while playing on the CRT? Then when they want to switch to the flat panel, turn the CRT off, set the Wii to 480p, and play that on a flat panel or scaler. That's an excellent question, and I have no idea. And there are certainly some cases that we would run into in the world of retro gaming where that would definitely not be a good idea. But I don't think that with the CRT powered off, you're actually sending a signal to anything, because it would be sending a signal to the chips that are not powered on, and it's nothing's going to the electron gun because that's powered off. You would really essentially just be using it at 75 ohm termination to route it through. I think that you would be okay. I think as long as you were very diligent about not having the CRT powered on, with consumer TVs that have standby mode or some BVMs, I guess, maybe that wouldn't be a good idea. But if there's a physical power switch in the back, or if it's like a standard PVM that has the push button, not the toggle push button, but physically in and out, so you're completely cutting the power, that should be fine. If it's a BVM, or I don't know if there's any PVMs in standby mode, but if it's a BVM, I would flip the switch in back. But I think that you would be okay. I think. If anybody has any other opinions, please post anywhere and I'll listen and talk about it again next week. But that should be okay. But that's an interesting one. That's a pretty cool question. I would just remember, too, you mentioned direct into the flat panel or scaler. I just would mention again that almost every flat panel that I've tried ever since I got my Time Sleuth has more lag through the component inputs than the HDMI, so you might want to run it through something, anything, even a cheap $20 component to HDMI converter. But that's just completely aside and has nothing to do with your direct question. I just figured I would mention that. I wish I'd found out about that sooner. I just didn't have a Time Sleuth to test until recently. Recently meaning whenever it was released. So, I have a few years of content before that talk about going direct into a flat panel. It's not always a big contrast, but it is more, and less is always better with lag. So just wanted to put that out there. Lopo is having an issue with their recording setup where their consoles go into G-Comp and G-SCART switches. One of the outputs is a display where the colors and everything look fine, and the other output goes direct into a DataPath Vision capture card, and that's too blue. They tried everything to tweak it, and I would assume that based on your question that you've tried multiple consoles. This isn't just one console. You didn't specify, but I have a feeling if it was like only PlayStation, the question might have been worded, I'm having problems capturing my PlayStation. So this is an interesting one. I would always try to figure out what in the chain could be causing it. Try to eliminate as much as possible for testing purposes. Try to go direct in. And alternatively, if you have any type of scaler at all, even something you could borrow from a friend, try going from a scaler and then HDMI into the capture card and see if that makes a difference. But basically, in long chain setups like this, you got to start pulling parts until you figure out exactly where the issue happens. I wish that the SCART cleaner and the comp cleaner were available still. That's a whole thing. We're trying to get them made. There was an alternative we were working on that's better for a bunch of reasons, but that project got put on hold, to be honest, because not many people do what we do. Not many people go direct into a data path when you have the OSSC and the retro tanks that work so well. But I'll try to get back on it. I'll contact the people that are doing it. But for your short-term solution, try to go direct any way that you can, especially with component video, because that should be very easy. You should just be able to get a basic generic DVI to component adapter. They still have them at a bunch of places. Remember, they're pass-through adapters, not any kind of powered adapter, but that should be good enough just to see where the issue lies. And other than that, I mean, just kind of start going through and seeing which change makes the difference. Ishan had a pretty interesting question. Basically, what's going to last longer? An FPGA recreation of an original console or an original console? And it's kind of interesting because at any point in time, 80s or right now in 2021, a company could skimp out and make things badly. You could use cheap components. You could have poor manufacturing processes. You could just have modern parts that don't last as long as their originals. But it doesn't necessarily mean that anything new isn't going to last as long as an old thing, or an old thing won't last as long as a new thing. There's so many different factors involved. What are the components that you're purchasing? What are the main processors? Are they something like embedded chipsets like FPGAs are that are designed to last a long time, or are they consumer grade chips that are just designed to last as long as they have to? And there's a lot of factors involved in that I would love to have just like an open discussion. Maybe do a podcast with much smarter nerds than me that could go through these things and discuss them. But your specific question was the analog consoles themselves, which are known to be made pretty well. Kevin's pretty strict in the things that he picks out. And even the example that I just made a few questions ago about companies in the 80s and 90s using cheaper components because overall it made by far the most sense. I think it's the opposite in analog's case. I think it would make more sense for them, because they're not making them in the millions, to use the better quality capacitors, because it's not really going to jack the price up that much. And it does kind of follow their marketing of like elitist products type of thing. And I like them. That's not an insult. I like the products, but it is what it is, right? And so I think the answer to your direct question is, if you have an original console, let's say an original NES that hypothetically never was taken out of the box, and then you have any of the modern analog consoles, the Mega, the Super, or the regular, the NT Mini, and you don't open that one, 30 years from now, the analog console is probably going to be perfect, and the old NES is probably going to have all of its capacitors either dried or leaked out, and the one in the RF box is probably going to leak out and spread across that board and corrode the board, so the NES won't work anymore. Same example, though, you have an NES right now that you have recapped, you've checked through, there's no issues lingering, there's no rust that's going to spread or anything like that, and you have a brand new analog console, they're probably both going to be fine in 30 years. So it's an interesting question. It's just something I would really love to dig deeper in with people that are more experts in stuff like that, and especially with modern components. But it's certainly a fun question to ponder. Watermelon Bonsai had a few questions. I read the entire question, but just in the interest of the listeners, I feel like it's better to just skip to the answer. But basically, they found a consumer-grade CRT, a Daewoo model that has component video inputs, and they were labeled YCBCR, so the assumption was that it would be 480p compatible, and it was not. Now, I'm sure there is a technical specification as to why something would be labeled YCBCR versus YPBPR, But my real world results in that is I think sometimes companies label stuff not knowing what the heck it is that they're labeling. It's, you know, I would love to hear Steve from HD Retrovision's opinion on this as well, but I've seen stuff that is labeled one or the other and it didn't mean anything per se. You know, it didn't change the way the signal worked. And the fact is that when it comes to CRTs, it's a combination of things that allow for more than 15 kilohertz. So from the jump from 480i to 480p. And in many cases, if you're just acquiring equipment, the only way to test it is just plug something in and test. Now in your setup, it seems like you already have a PVM and that's 15 kilohertz only, and you were hoping to pick up this consumer TV for 480p stuff. My suggestion for that is if you want 480p stuff on a CRT, grab any PC VGA monitor, any one of them, as long as it powers up, there's no burn-in, and the tube isn't dim. And then get any kind of converter for that. LinuxBot 3000, I believe, makes component to VGA converters. There's some other stuff out there. You could go with the RetroTink comp to RGB and then use like an Extron device to go from there. It's probably more expensive than you're looking to go for, but there's a bunch of different solutions for that would take care of it. But my advice to anybody is for looking for component video is look at the specs, don't look at the labels, because the labels have been all over the place. And I've even seen, I owned a TV, in fact, that it was a Luva. I can't remember if it was the Articos or the Aconda, but one of the two only had VGA and component video inputs, but the component video was 15 kilohertz only, and the VGA was either 480p or 1080i, not 720p. It was very weird, but it just, you know, at the time it was, you take whatever you get for stuff like that. So I wouldn't really worry so much about labels and just try it out. And, you know, the good thing about this is, you know, post somewhere and say, hey, I got this TV. I thought it was 480p. It's only 480i or 240p. Anybody want it? I'm sure your fellow retro gaming nerds would jump on that, who's looking for a CRT and doesn't have a PVM. Your last question is, since you now have all these HD RetroVision cables, I was thinking of getting a RetroTink 2X Pro multi-format for use on an HD TV. I know you and a lot of others have said the 2XM is perfect for the 6th gen of consoles, especially regards to 480p. That's about all I will use it with, as again, everything else from earlier generations would be played on my PVM. Does this sound like a good solution to you? So, there's no right answer. The only wrong answer is buying a TV scaler and trying to use it for video games. But there's a couple of things that you could do. If the consoles that you're talking about are natively 480p, you could just get a cheap $20 component video to HDMI converter and play those on your HD TV. And let your TV do the scaling, but it should be very minimal lag, and it should all work perfect for a very cheap price. You said that you'd plan on using anything that's under 480p on your PVM. This would only be for your HD TV. So that's certainly something you might want to look into. If you have other consoles that are composite or S-video based, the 2XM is a great choice because you'd be able to use those on your HD TV as well. But it's my strong opinion that a composite or S-video console, more composite, would look way better on a CRT no matter what. And you already have a great PVM. So I would, if I were you, I would probably just pick up a cheap $20 device and see how that works and kind of go from there, and then maybe wait to see what the OSSC Pro is like and what some of the other devices out there are like. You might even be able to pick up a used OSSC now and try using that to go from 480p to 960p. That's pretty cool. So that way you could have both sharp and soft scaling. One of the coolest things with the 4K TV that I've seen is taking 480p content, doubling it to 960p, and then letting the TV stretch it the rest of the way. So the TV's smooth stretching it, so it's not too sharp, but it definitely looks like it feels higher resolution. It's just a trick, obviously, but it almost feels like the console itself is higher than 480p. Just an illusion. Again, I'm not trying to say it's rendering your console higher or anything like that. So, I mean, or of course you could just wait to see what other scalers are coming out in the next year or two. But yeah, I'd probably just go with the cheapest option, because that's also a tool you could leave in your drawer. You know, a lot of these things that we use on a day-to-day basis could also just be used as tools for other stuff. And even the person before who talked about having problems with their capture card, having one of these laying around somewhere to be able to test with would be really handy for troubleshooting. So stuff like that, I would always confidently say just drop the $20. Even if it's not the perfect solution, you could use it for 10 other things as well. Jonathan Levine had a question that I feel like I need to be very careful in answering. I've probably tried 10 times already, and I keep saying too much, so let me try to less is more this one. The question is the pre-built Mister that they found on AliExpress a good option? And that is a hard no, because that is a known clone company. Now, of course, the Mister project is open source, and a lot of the stuff required to plug into it is also open source. And there is a chance that they bought high quality components, they followed the spec exactly, and they had it manufactured in a good facility. It's definitely a chance. But there's also a chance that they cut corners the same way that they cut corners stealing products from people in the retro gaming world. And maybe they used cheap components. Maybe they used a low quality manufacturer that threw the stuff together. Maybe they didn't test them at all after they made them. So that's definitely a hard no. That company goes under at least 3 different names. You all know one of them, that's for sure. But I do also want to make the point, because I try to always make this point, just because something is on AliExpress or Taobao doesn't mean it's a clone, and it doesn't mean it's a low quality item. There's tons of stuff on there that are garbage, but there's also a lot of stuff that isn't. I'll give a very quick sneak peek. There is another Mr. seller that doesn't sell in the US yet that makes some absolutely awesome cases that I really love that are right up there with pork chops. So I wanted to put that out there as, there are good alternatives, but I would strongly recommend buying from people with a good reputation, and especially when it comes to stuff like Mister, because it is open source, and a clone company could absolutely make a run of 20,000 and try to undercut the good people that tested and made these things, and they could do it, especially being open source, and not have to worry about anything. So I would really look in, figure out where you're located, and then kind of get whatever is either your absolute favorite that you have to have. I needed to test that specific one for one of its features. I'll have a whole video on this stuff at some point soon. So either get something that's the exact features that you want, or seller in the country that you're in, or close to at least the country that you're in, and go from there. And there's a ton of people with really, really good reputations that make quality stuff, that have good customer service. I've talked about Pork Chop Express a lot, MrAddons.com, it's one and the same. This seller I'll be talking about, I think they're trying to get distribution worldwide, so I'm going to hold off a little bit before they're available, because it is a pain to get them direct now. And of course, I believe Antonia Valena has a bunch of products, and I'm so sorry for drawing a blank. There's at least 2 or 3 other sellers worldwide that do a really good job and care about the project. My apologies to you. I'm so sorry that your name is slipping. But I could see your websites in my head at the moment. But just do a little bit of research, please. Jonathan, I am not coming down on you for asking the question. I appreciate that you asked the question. I just kind of want to get the word out there to everybody. Take your time, do some research, ask questions like you have, and make sure to support the right people, because it is a shame that there are clone companies out there invading retro gaming. Jason Guffey is using one of those RGB to S-video converters from LinuxBot 3000. I believe it's the same typical setup that people have, where they probably have all RGB set up with their console, a dual output, one going to their scaler, and then, hey, let me pick up a CRT for when I want to have that experience, and run it through this type of converter to get S-video out. Now, I've talked a lot about how RGB to composite video doesn't work right in this scenario for a whole bunch of very complicated reasons that I don't know if it's possible to get solved, but we're working on it. However, in my very limited testing, RGB to S video seemed to work fine. Now, when I say limited, basically I plugged it in, threw up some color bars, and it didn't look right on composite, looked fine on S video, left it running, came back an hour or 2 later, it still looked fine. Played a couple of rounds of Sonic and Super Mario World. That looked good enough, so I called it a win, and I plan on someday going back to doing a test. So that seemed to work, and that also seemed to work for Jason for about a day or two. But now they're having bizarre color issues that seems to be like what I described when the problems happened over composite. So that's pretty interesting. And so I guess there's two things. One is, did you unplug and replug it a lot in the course of this entire testing? Because while you couldn't have really shorted anything out, it's possible that something had a cold solder joint, and plugging the S-Video connector in may have wiggled something. Same thing on the SCART side. It's possible that it got damaged in shipping, but still worked, but then just banging it around wherever it is that you have it might have kicked something loose. So I would open it up and check that stuff. And if you have a soldering iron, this is super easy. Just try to reflow the SCART pins and the S-Video pins. And you know, that's never a hard thing to do, and it's never a harmful thing to do. Just don't use like an industrial strength soldering iron that, you know, that's 80 watts or something like that. You know, make sure it's the right tools for retro gaming. But I would try that. I would take a look at the board. If you have a magnifying glass, those are usually more than enough, and just see if something jumps right out. You know, is there a component broken off or anything like that? But if not, then I don't know. It could very well be that there's also a problem going RGB to S-Video, but the fact that it worked fine for a day or two and then stopped, that's kind of the weird thing for me. So I would just do some troubleshooting and see if there's and also see if there's a very specific scenario that you could reproduce it. Does it always freak out with Sega Genesis, but not with Atari 2600 or Nintendo or something? Just see if you could nail it down, and also let me know what you get. I might be able to test some of the equipment here depending on time frame and stuff like that as well. Also, you had another question about a modern game and stuff like that. And respectfully, I don't really know enough about the situation to be comfortable giving an answer. I would know just as much as everybody else following along on Twitter. So it would feel out of place for me to comment on that. So, you know, as always, though, any questions anybody have, fire away. I'm never offended by them. I don't want to try to fumble through an answer without really knowing what I'm talking about. I'd rather just admit I don't know enough and move on. So sorry about that. Well, that's it for this week. As always, thanks so much to everybody that participates in these. I do have a really good time doing them. And especially thank you to everybody that supports, because even though I'm probably annoying people saying it every week, I do genuinely mean it. And I never want to stop saying thank you so much for the support, because it's what's keeping all of this stuff going. So if you're interested at all in any of the things that I'm involved in, whether it's these Q&As, the posts, the development work that I'm a part of, the videos that I do, just the podcast, any of it at all, please consider supporting in any way. Go to retrorgb.com/support. You could sign up for the monthly services, or even as simple as just go buy something off of Amazon that you were going to buy anyway, but click through the link and I get like a fraction of a penny for every purchase or something. But it all adds up and it all helps. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.